Chapter 1. Miss Whitmer, who taught English at Foster Academy, always said that the best way to begin a story is to start with the first important or exciting incident and then fill in the background. So I'm going to start with the rainy Sunday last November when I met Annie Kenyon. I've wanted to be an architect since long before I could spell the word, so I've always spent a lot of my time at museums. That day, to help focus my mind on focus my ideas for the solar house I was designing for my senior project, I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to visit the Temple of Denver and the American Wing. The museum was so full of people, I decided to start with the American Wing because it's sometimes less crowded, especially up on the third floor where I wanted to go. And at first it seemed as if that was going to be true. When I got to the top of the stairs, everything was so quiet I thought there might even be no one there at all. But as I started walking toward the colonial rooms, I heard someone singing. I remember I stood and listened for a minute and then went toward the sound, mostly out of curiosity, but also because whoever it was had a wonderful voice. There was a girl about my age, 17, sitting at a window in one of the oldest colonial rooms, singing and gazing outside. Even though I knew that the only thing outside the window was a painted backdrop, there was something about the girl, the gray cape she was wearing and the song she was singing, that made it easy to imagine Plymouth Plantation or Massachusetts Bay Colony outside instead. Oh, Plymouth Bay. Okay, I see. The girl looked as if she could have been a young colonial woman, and her song seemed sad. At least the feeling behind it did. I didn't pay much attention to the words. After a moment or two, the girl stopped singing, although she still kept looking out the window. "Don't stop," I heard myself saying. "Please." The girl jumped as if my voice had frightened her, and she turned around. She had very long black hair and a round face with a small little kid's nose and a sad-looking mouth. But it was her eyes I noticed most. They were as black as her hair, and they looked as if there was more behind them than any person could possibly ever know. "Oh," she said, putting her hand to her throat. It was a surprisingly long, slender hand, in contrast to the roundness of her face. "You startled me. I didn't know anyone was there." She pulled her cape more closely around her. "It was beautiful, the singing," I said quickly, before I could feel self-conscious. I smiled at her. She smiled back, tentatively, as if she was still getting over being startled. "I don't know what that song was, but it sounded just like something someone would have sung in this room." The girl's smile deepened, and her eyes sparkled for just a second. "Oh, do you really think so?" she said. "It wasn't a real song. I was just making it up as I went along. I was pretending that I was a colonial girl who missed England, her best friend, things like that. And her dog, she'd been allowed to take her cat, but not her dog. She laughed. I think the dog's name was something terribly original like Spot. I laughed too, and then I couldn't think of anything more to say. The girl walked to the door, as if she were going to leave, so I quickly said, Do you come here often? Immediately, I felt my cringe at how dumb it sounded. She didn't seem to think it was dumb. She shook her head, as if it were a serious question, and said, No, I have to spend a lot of time practicing, only that gets dull sometimes. She tossed her hair back over the shoulder of her cape. The cape fell open a little, and I could see that under she was wearing a very uncolonial pair of green corduroy jeans and a brown sweater. Practicing? I asked. Singing, you mean? She nodded and said in an offhand way, I'm in this special group at school. We keep having to give recitals. Do you come here often? She was standing fairly close to me now, leaning against the door frame, her head tipped a little to one side. I told her I did, and explained about wanting to be an architect and about the solar house. When I said I was going to the Temple of Dender, she said she'd never been to it, except outside the museum, and asked, Mind if I come? I was surprised to find that I didn't. I usually liked to be by myself in museums, especially when I'm working on something. No, I said. Okay. No, I don't mind. We walked all the way downstairs, me feeling kind of awkward before I had the sense to say, What's your name? Annie Kenyon, she said. What's that? I said Liza Winthorpe before I realized that wasn't what she'd asked. We'd just gotten to the medieval art section, which is a big open room with a magnificent choir screen, an enormous gold-painted wrought iron grating running the whole section. Annie stood in front of it, her eyes very bright. It's from a Spanish cathedral, I said, showing off. 1668. It is beautiful, Annie interrupted. She stood there silently, as if she were in awe of the screen, and then bowed her head. 2 or 3 people were coming in. 2 or 3 people coming in glanced at her curiously, and I tried to tell myself that it was ridiculous for me to feel uneasy. You could walk away, I remember thinking. You don't know this person at all. Maybe she's crazy. Maybe she's some kind of religious fanatic. But I didn't walk away, and in a couple of seconds she turned, smiling. I'm sorry, she said, as we left the room. If I embarrassed you. That's okay, I said. Even so, I led Annie fairly quickly to the Hall of Arms and Armor, which I usually go through on my way to the temple. The hall is one of my favorite parts of the museum. One is greeted at its door by a life-sized procession of knights in full armor, on horseback. The first knight has his lance at the ready, pointed straight ahead, which means right at whoever walks in. Annie seemed to love it. I think that's one of the first things that made me decide I really did like her, even though she seemed a little strange. "Oh, look!" she exclaimed, walking around the procession. "Oh, they're wonderful!" She walked faster, flourishing an imaginary lance, and then began prancing as if she were on horseback herself. Part of me wanted to join in, as I said, I've always loved those knights myself, and besides, I'd been a King Arthur not since I was little. But the other part of me was stiff with embarrassment. "Annie," I began in the warning voice my mother used to use when me and my brother got too exuberant as children. But by then Annie had pretended to fall off her horse and dropped her lance. She drew an imaginary sword so convincingly I knew I was admiring her skill in spite of myself. And then when she cried, "On God, stand and fight, or I'll run you through," I knew I wasn't going to be able to keep from smiling much longer. "If you do not fight me, knight," she said, "you will rue the day that ever you unhorsed me here in this green wood." I had to laugh then. Her mood was so catching. Besides, by then I'd noticed that the only other people around were a couple of little boys watching from the opposite end of the hall. In the next minute, I completely stopped resisting. I imagined a horse and leapt down from it, crying in my best King Arthur style, "I will not fight an unhorsed knight, and me mounted. By now that I am on the ground, you will not live to tell the tale of the day's battle." I pretended to throw aside my lance and draw a sword too. "Nor you!" cried Annie, with a lack of logic that we laughed about later. Have at you then," she shouted, swiping at me with her sword. In another minute we were both hopping in and out of the processions of knights, laying about with our imaginary swords and shouting chivalrous insults at each other. After about the third insult, the little boys left the other end of the hall and came over to watch us. "I'm for the one in the cape," one of them shouted. "Go, Cape!" "I'm not," said his friend. "Go, Raincoat!" Annie and I caught each other's eyes, and I realized that we were making a silent agreement to fight on to the death for the benefit of our audience. The only trouble was I wasn't sure how we were going to signal each other which one of us were to die and when. "Hey, here, what's going on here? Stop that, you two." "This instant old enough to know better, aren't you?" I felt a strong hand close around my shoulder, and I turned and saw the uniform of a museum guard, topped by a very red, very angry face. "We're terribly sorry, sir," Annie said, with a look of such innocence I didn't see how anyone could possibly be angry at her. "The knights are so splendid. I've never seen them before. I got carried away." "Harumph," the guard said, loosening his hold on my shoulder and saying again, "Old enough to know better, both of you." He glared at the two little boys, who by now were huddled together, mouths wide open. "Don't let this give you any ideas," he roared after them as they scurried off like a pair of frightened field mice. When they were gone, the guards scowled at us again. His forehead scowled, that is, but his didn't look angry. Darn good fight. He grunted. Ought to do Shakespeare in the park, you two. But no more, he said, shaking his finger. Not here, understood? Oh, yes, sir, Annie said, contritely, and I nodded, and we stood there, practically holding our breaths as he lumbered away. The second he was gone, we both burst out laughing. Oh, Liza, Annie said, I don't know when I've had so much fun. Neither do I said, truthfully. And hey, guess what? I wasn't even embarrassed, except right at the beginning. Then a funny thing happened. We looked at each other, really looked. I mean, for the first time, and for a moment or two, I don't think I could have told anyone my name, let alone where I was. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before, and I know, it scared me. It was a bit longer before I could speak, and even then, all I could say was, Come on, the temple's this way. We went silently through the Egyptian section, and I watched Annie's face as we walked into the Sackler wing, and she saw the Temple of Dender with the pool and open space in front of it. It's a sight that stuns most people, and it still stuns me, even though I've been there so many times. It's the absence of shadows, I think, and the brightness. Stark and pure, even on a day as rainy as that one was. Light streaks in through glass panels that are as open as the sky and reflecting from the pool, making the temple's present setting seem, as vast and present as vast and changeable as its original one on the river Nile. Original one on the river Nile must have been thousands of years ago. Annie gasped as soon as we walked in. It's outdoors, she said. Like it, I mean, but exactly like it. She threw out her arms, as if embracing all of it, and let out her breath in an exasperated sigh, as if she were frustrated at not being able to find the right words. I know, I said. I'd never felt I'd find the right words either, and Annie smiled. Then, her back very straight, she walked slowly around the the pool, and to the temple, as if she were the goddess Isis herself, inspecting it for the first time and approving. When she came back, she stood so close to me that our hands would have touched if we'd moved them. Thank you, she said softly, for showing me this. The choir screen, too. She stepped back a little. This room seems like you. She smiled, bright and clear, not somber like me in the screen room. But I stopped, realizing I was about to say beautiful, surprised at thinking it and confused again. Annie's smile deepened, as if she heard my thought, but then she turned away. I should go, she said. It's getting late. Where do you live? The words slipped out before I could think much about them, but there didn't seem to be any reason not to ask. Way uptown, Annie said after hesitating a moment. Oh my gosh, what's happening to me? Here. She pushed her cape back and groped in a pocket, pulling out a pencil stub and a little notebook. She scribbled her address and phone number, tore the page off, and handed it to me. Now you have to give me yours. I did, and then we sort of chatted as we walked through the Egyptian section and outside into the rain. I didn't remember what we said, but I do remember feeling that something important had happened, and that words didn't matter much. In a few more minutes, Annie was on a crosstown bus, and I was heading in the opposite direction to get to IRT subway home to Brooklyn. I was halfway home before I realized I hadn't done any thinking about my solar house project at all.